So this is part two of the Science Museum tour. It's a very large museum, as we probably established in my last video. On the first video we went through the ground floor, but now we're moving on to the second and third floor, and I'm going to probably move through some stuff fairly swiftly, but you've probably already got the idea. It's quite a substantial museum. From the ground floor, we've taken the lift up to the top, the third floor, and there's a very large flight gallery here. So just running through a few of them, you've got the Pitts Special there. It's probably the most famous of the aerial aerobatics planes. There's an example of an airliner's wheel here, where you see the scale of it. That's, over 6 foot high, along with some jet engines. The smaller one on the left is the jet engine from Concorde, but actually, although they're much slower, aircraft have been getting bigger engines. Certainly by modern standards, these are very small, but a larger turbine that has more length to the blades is actually a lot more efficient, which is how they've been able to get 30% efficiency savings on jet engines for airliners over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years. Beautiful example, that's from a 747. And I'd say I'm an aircraft nerd, but probably not an engine aircraft nerd. You could do an entire video on the engines in this section, so I'm not going to dwell too long on them. But it's very comprehensive, from these sort of what were at the time of this exhibition in the 70s very modern jet engines, through to, it starts back with First World War and Second World War, interwar, progresses through the different types of engines, and there's some very good examples of propeller and jet engines. We'll just work our way along the wall here. There's a structure hanging probably about 20 different engines, maybe more. So we start off here with some of the compressor-based jet engines, where you can see the structure's very different to modern day ones. Radial engines, and then inline. So you've got twin inlines there. These are after 1945. But there's a V1 rocket opened up so that you can see the insides of those two balls. Actually hold the engine fuel, the liquid fuel to power the rocket, because it's not strictly an engine, it's a rocket. So it's not like a jet engine that feeds fuel through, it just burns a payload. These are, I think, Jumos. They're jet engines from Germany in the latter period of the war. Very different from the Gloucester Meteor's engine that we saw earlier, and you see this here, early British jet engine. Up above, an army helicopter. That's actually a Wasp. And here's some German engines. Top there. And you can see how they're inline. This era, they're much more like car engines. They're factored for the shape of a plane and for the efficiency of the bank of pistons, but they're very different to the latter jet engines. And you see them in, there's two banks in a V shape. There's side by sides, there's these radial engines here. And I'd love to talk through them, but I know that most people watching this video would be quite bored. So I'm just going to say that there's a series of engines covering the evolution of engine technology. And although it starts with the jets, goes back through post-war, wartime jet engines, wartime piston engines, which were propeller-driven planes, and then goes back to the interwar period, where you could see some of these are much more like, almost like the engine in a VW Beetle, and some very substantial power plants. These inline V shape. 3 sets of pistons there. One cut through so you can get an understanding of the inside. Very interesting collection of engines. And we go back to pre-war, and you can see much simpler engines. Certainly an engineer would want to talk through this in a lot more detail, but quite intriguing. The ingenuity, and you can see the denseness of the engineering. It's not as simple as 1 or 2 moving parts, but they're entire machines all by themselves. And there's some interesting aircraft hanging above as well. So I'm kind of skipping through this engine section, and it's fairly cut short because I'm sure that a lot of viewers aren't looking at each individual engine. But I certainly enjoyed going through here. So I guess I am a bit of an aircraft engine nerd. Down at the end here is a beautiful collection of aircraft. And really this whole hall, it's very small, but it contains so much history. And there's some very unique pieces in here that anyone who's interested in aviation should definitely come here. There's a good section on Blériot at the end, 1921 I think it was. He landed in Dover after flying over the English Channel, the first powered flight over the English Channel. If you go to Dover Castle, the overflow car park round the side you can actually get in. Here's Blériot's flyer and some cross sections and explanation. The Wright flyer, there's a small model here, and then actually hanging up above is a full-scale replica of the Wright flyer, which is actually in the Smithsonian Aerospace Museum. I believe there's actually quite a bit of debate over whether it's really the first powered manned flight, but there was an agreement with one of the Wright brothers that the Smithsonian could only display the original if they maintained that fact. So it's a very important, very early plane, but there is an argument it's not actually the first example. There's a replica there of Blériot's flyer, and over in the distance there you can see the first recorded non-powered flight, where it's effectively a glider where you drop off a hill and float down, but it was controlled flight, not falling. And he's certainly a braver man than me to want to jump off a hill wearing that wing that you could arguably call a plane. There's Blériot's up there. And there's a good explanation of the history of how flight works, working out the mechanics of how flying works, looking at building gliders, replicating how birds fly, but also realizing that how birds fly isn't really relevant to human flight. So then transitioning through here, you've got replica of Montgolfier's balloon, which famously took off from Paris in a demonstration flight. And here is a section on the excitement of flight. The flight was such a sexy and new thing that there was a lot of commemorative and memorabilia at the time. This cabinet really is undervalued. It's very important. George Cayley actually carried out the first powered flights that are recorded, and he did a series of experiments with steam powered, effectively a small steam engine with a model. And although it wasn't manned, it was instrumental to understanding the aerodynamics of flight. And if anything, the aerodynamics probably were a bit more sophisticated in those than the ones which flew with the first people. Here's from, I believe that's from a airship, the one on the left. It's very early planes, beautiful examples. And you can climb up this staircase in a second. Some models of some very key moments in early flight with a good explanation of how people experimented and worked out how to fly. And up here you can really see the collection much better. I particularly like that autogyro there. They were a early war, pre-war tool that was used very widely to calibrate radars, so they could hover on the spot, so you could calibrate a distance, because while a plane had to keep moving to stay in the air, the autogyro had the advantage that because it had a propeller to push it forward, but it actually maintained lift with what effectively was like a helicopter. Now, it's not a helicopter, because a helicopter controls its forward motion through the blades at the top and the tilt and the angle of them, whereas it hovers using it. There, the green one, you've got a de Havilland Comet, beautiful example. There's a Handley Page there. They made bombers and transport aircraft. Here's the autogyro, beautiful example. Not that many, I think there was 2 squadrons in service, so lovely to see an example, and I believe it is. And I believe all of these are originals except where they're specifically called out. Now you have the Wasp that we saw from below, an early RAF scouting helicopter used by the Army. And you can see the V1 there. And beautiful piece here I like is this Comet. It's a Messerschmitt Comet, beautiful. It was a jet powered, so it would take off on a jet launch, fly, achieve its aim, and then land on that little runner. They have a Hurricane and a Spitfire, instantly recognisable, the 2 British fighter jets from the Second World War. But behind it there is the S6, Supermarine S6, which really is, I've never seen another example, and although they built them for a series of years, Supermarine competed for the Schneider Cup, which we'll see in a second. And it's from that the Spitfire evolved, and certainly with the aerodynamic lessons. Here's the Comet. You can see that skid. You had to land on that skid at high speed. Very little ability to steer, and you just had the forward momentum you were already carrying. So a lot of them were lost, and I think even the test pilots died during test flying. Quite a dangerous plane. That little copper propeller at the front is actually to maintain electric energy when you've run out of power. The forward momentum spins that propeller and that generates electricity. Much like on modern airplanes, they have a small propeller that can be dropped in the case of loss of power, and it translates the forward energy into enough electricity to keep key systems running. If you watch the film about the miracle of the Hudson, you'll see he's deploying that in the first couple of seconds before they actually hit that on the checklist is what saved the plane, really. There's Gloucester Meteor, the first jet engine to be in the RAF service. There's, I think it's a Gulfstream down there. And there's a prototype of the Harrier jump jet. That's not the actual jump jet, but it's a very early or very late prototype before development. Much as you see the early prototype downstairs, the flying bedstead, there's a good example of a glider in the background. And then to the left here you can see the Spitfire and Hurricane. It's a very early, I think it's a Mark 1 Spitfire. You could tell by the elliptical wings and the shape of the front. There's a cross section of a 747 which gives you an idea of the sheer scale of it. You do see nose sections of military planes at some aircraft museums, but it's a lovely example of a cross section where you really get a feeling for the scale of modern air transport. There's the Harrier jump jet, various models. There's some examples of models of airports. I think that's Stansted Airport. Some uniforms. Idea of how black boxes work. There's some early black boxes. The modern ones, they're still that orange colour, but they're a lot more developed and substantial. Some examples here of wing structure. So there's some models of some significant aircraft. And then you see earlier ones. So here's civilian planes from, I don't know, a couple of military ones there. There's a Javelin. There's a Vampire there. Scimitar. I think that might be a Vickers Valiant. You can actually see the nose cone of Vickers Valiant. RAF Hendon we'll be going to in a couple of weeks. So some interesting models of different periods of aviation post-war. There's cross-section of a Lancaster bomber, so you get an idea of the structure of it, along with some pieces from a Lancaster. And there's some of the pilot uniforms you could see before you had pressurized airplanes. A beautiful collection here of Second World War models. So you have the Lancaster, Anson, BF-109, and a lot of planes that any teenage modelers would have had. This is a really beautiful piece. The Schneider Cup, which the Schneider Trophy was a seaplane race that was primarily fought out between UK, France, Italy, Germany and America, but I think it was open to everyone. And Supermarine, who manufactured the Spitfire, they built this by Reginald J. Mitchell, designed it. I think we'll be going to the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in a few months. And Reginald J. Mitchell is a sort of local hero there. There's a sculpture of him made out of slate by a famous artist who made a beautiful one of touring if you go to the Bletchley Park Museum. Yes, this Supermarine S6, beautiful aircraft, looks rather sad for itself, sits here pretty ignored by a lot of the visitors, but probably the most significant aircraft in this collection and really one of a kind. I really loved it, but then I am a bit of an aircraft nerd. Follow back round to the cabinets. Yeah, the Schneider Trophy. I wasn't aware the Schneider Trophy was here, but this really was the America's Cup of its day. And a lot of aviation progress was made because of this. And here you have things like the Tante-Dieu, the J-52. There was a DC-3 back there, sections of some aircraft. Some models of interwar aircraft. You have a beautiful seaplane there, and some of the airships, the R101, which the British tried to compete with the Graf Zeppelin, but it crashed and burned just the same as the Hindenburg, so really brought an end to that era. And here's some First World War models, some pieces from planes, good explanation of that, and some of the uniforms that were worn by pilots and some of the rather eccentric aerodynamic designs. Now, after the flight section, you move through to computing, and it's a very interesting exhibition. I really don't remember this from previous visits. Perhaps I just never reached through to this section, but you have this aerial walkway where you can see a few things that aren't visible from below, but also get a perspective on everything else. You could just skip down the stairs because there isn't really much more from up here, just a slightly different perspective on it. But it's a beautifully presented gallery. I mean, perhaps that hints at the fact that it's a more modern gallery, that I don't need to feel guilty that I skipped them on a previous visit. Here you have a satellite, I think it's for TV transmission. And this goes through the whole of telecommunications here. So you have in the centre there, we'll get to in a bit, you have a large aerial for radio transmission, I think at Rugby. Here's a section on the internet that explains the World Wide Web. Downstairs you can see the actual source code for it, and there's a little speech by Tim Berners-Lee, who was responsible for the World Wide Web being invented. And he designed it on that little black computer down there, which is the Next, which If You Know Your Computers is actually the company that was founded by Steve Jobs when he was kicked out of Apple before he came back. Never really went everywhere and is always dismissed as a side story in computing. But actually the first web pages and the first World Wide Web sat on one of those at CERN. So I would recommend going down that stairs because it goes the whole way round and largely you don't see much more than you would upstairs. I did like this. It's a mobile phone antenna, but instead of having an ugly mobile antenna on a hillside, it's disguised as a cactus, so it kind of looks like part of the landscape. And here's an interesting section on the telecoms cables that go underneath the sea. We'll plod our way around here, probably skip through to the next floor. When you're trying to transmit something like radio, obviously bigger is better. So the way this was handled here was rather than having some immensely tall structure that has to stand in the wind, actually that cable is the antenna and it's spun around these spindles so that a very long structure is turned into something a bit more compact. Here is a section on telecommunications, the BT Tower, which used to be the post office tower when it was first built, some various boxes for descrambling television, translating different forms of analog and digital television. There's an explanation of the close down of analog TV when everything went digital, and some early TVs and visual tools for the home, so you can see the size of them. There's a lovely little one in a corner here where it's playing the Queen's speech and you see the size and definition of the TV that people actually watched and how remarkably it's changed over the last 50-60 years. This is the end of analog. I do remember the switch off. Here's a replica of a Russian tower for transmitting signals at the end of the war. It was seen as a sort of monument of Soviet science. It sat just outside of Moscow, I believe. Very beautiful model of it. Kind of gets across the sheer scale of it. Here we have telephones. So there's some beautiful examples of old telephones, old switching technology, automated switching, and then there's the manual switching where a controller would sit and plug a cable and change which socket it plugged into to connect the call. And through the different eras of the evolution of that system, you can see the sort of pre-transistor through to the modern electronic management of that, and some examples of telephones. There's some quite funny phones. I even recognized one of the phones that my parents had, not in this cabinet, not that old. Here's various interesting, for historic reasons, telephones. There's a data transmission one at the end here where you could put your phone on top and type the text message and it would send it through as a precursor of a fax machine. And there's a manual exchange like you'll see in a movie. And there's a sort of model where you can have a go at connecting phone calls and get the idea of how it worked. And everyone's favourite phone box. They used to be on every street corner, but as they got modernised, the replacements weren't half as loved as these, and these actually got kept. There's one outside the Science Museum, a little bit down. It's nearer to the Victoria and Albert, and it's preserved. and there's some outside the British Museum that have been maintained as well, and you do see them out and about around London. Certainly if you go into the villages, a lot of villagers did not want one of those ugly modern monstrosities that came afterwards. Certainly an investment I missed out on. I was a bit too young, is buying one of those, because they're definitely worth more now than they were then. Here was an explanation of undersea cables and various tools and pieces of equipment for joining and pulling and dragging and connecting. This is a repeater, so if you run a cable for 2,000 kilometers under the sea, the strength of the signal will drop. So every so often you need to have one of these devices which takes the signal and boosts it, and just basically make sure that you get a clean signal out of the end. It was quite a good explanation of that, which I'm sure I didn't do justice to. Along with various radio transmission and communications. Very thorough gallery, much more so than I expected. There on the left it's a Google Street View camera powered on the back of a tricycle bike, so that they can take the Street View cameras where you wouldn't normally be able to. Along with here some examples of cameras from taking pictures from space. The bottom one's actually a stereoscope, so you look through the two at two photos and it combines it and tricks the mind into a 3D image. And here's some of the space visualization. So this section covers taking pictures and video and seeing the world. Obligatory satellite. This is the first transmission to be at worldwide. So it's a TV transmission of children being born or newly born, and it was transmitting something like 30 or 40 countries. First of its time, pretty much forgotten these days, but it's got an exhibit that probably dates back to that. Here's Telstar, it's the first TV satellite, and there's an explanation of that and a model, quite remarkable. There's Tomahawk missile up there. If you watch the Gulf War, this is about GPS. So if you watch the Gulf War live, you'll remember the Tomahawk missiles flying down the road system guided by GPS. And after the Gulf War, GPS suddenly became a thing that everyone knew about, and it was refined, and it's now accurate to a much lower distance, and B, made publicly available, which is why you have it in your phone today. And now there's GLONASS, there's Russian and Chinese versions that are very popular worldwide. There's some stuff about Alan Turing and early computing in terms of valve computing, first modern computers, supercomputers, explanations of scientific breakthroughs. Here is the next. So this is the often talked about and often dismissed computer designed by a team run by Steve Jobs. But this is the one that actually the World Wide Web was built on in its first form at CERN. And a good explanation of CERN's work on that and the reasons for the internet, why it was created. There's Tim Berners-Lee on the right, who basically formed the World Wide Web, linked together with hypertext markup language. And with communication comes computers, and this hall has this beautiful central piece by Zaha Hadid, the architect, and a significant collection of important measurement and calculation. Here's a system of measures from 1600s. Here's a post-war measurements for a local council so they could check the scales for local shops, ensure that they weren't cheating people. Is beautiful, this central piece. And here an early calculator, so the turning of the gears calculates values. And many explanation of London as a city from 1500 through to 1830, where there was a lot of science. Some globes here. Again, our friend Herschel gets a mention with his telescopes. Various scientific texts, pictures, instruments. And it links through very well to the next section, which is the Clock Museum. This is the hall we walked into, the original steam hall, but now up on the 3rd floor. This next section we're really not going to do justice to. It's the Clock Museum, and there's a large collection. It's very extensive and it goes back a very long way. There's some beautiful examples from 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, right through to today. Excellent explanation of some of the best clocksmiths and the work they carried out, the quality of their work, the beauty of it, the examples. Now, if I stopped and did this properly and showed you these, A, you'd probably stop watching it because the video would go on so long, but B, you just can't see through the glass cabinets with a camera how beautiful these are. And it's extraordinary, the artistry and the engineering behind these watches, and it is a substantial collection. So I'd say you should definitely come here if you're at all interested in watches. It's officially listed as a separate museum, which is now inside here. Comes from, and I believe it's owned by one of the Royal Colleges of people who work with clocks. Really beautiful. I actually spent quite a while in this section, but decided not to film too long a form on it, just because you can't do justice to them through the glass cabinets. But you can see these beautiful grandfather clocks and the different mechanisms, the way they work, paintings of famous clocksmiths, and some very beautiful clocks. When you see how elaborate they are, the mechanisms, the working and what they achieved, it's quite remarkable considering how boring most of our modern day clocks work. But there's a real artistry and engineering to these. And again, round the other side we have a section about London as a scientific city. And it explains, like here's one of Herschel's telescopes there. Really it's the science city. So goes through all of the breakthroughs in science, or at least some of. But you can see here beautiful examples of Herschel's work in telescopes. And you can see measurement of the stars, measurement of space, sextant there. So if you've ever seen the series Longitude, the whole way that they measured the stars, there's beautiful examples, which really, other than sort of scientific instrument museums that you'll see in Oxford or Cambridge, hopefully you've watched my video on the Cambridge one, the collection here is excellent. And very significant pieces. Again, it's a beautifully curated museum, this. Although the museum in many ways hasn't changed that much in the last sort of 40 years, it's a collection that's been curated for over a century. So it really is a world-leading collection of scientific instruments and breakthroughs and pieces of engineering. Here's an example for comparing the content of two jars. So it's like an atmospheric comparison experiment. And this is, I think, George IV, who was very into science. They built this as a table for his house. So he could actually see demonstrations of experiments. Think of the chemistry or science sets you buy for a 10-year-old down at the shops for Christmas. This was the King's version of that. And it's a beautiful painting of London there. It's actually building of Westminster Bridge, so you get a feeling how that's built, but you also see how substantially the Houses of Parliament has changed. It doesn't look anything like the one today. Some examples here of microscopes, telescopes, early flight. Again, you really can take some time and absorb this section. It's beautiful. Very significant pieces, not just random old things to a theme. It's a very well curated museum. And hopefully I've given you a feeling in these two videos of just how substantial it is. It's the first museum that I've had split into two videos. Now we're down to the second floor, and this is split into displays basically aimed at teenagers to understand what exactly it is that scientists and engineers do. So as you walk round, you have explanations of engineers, and it kind of shows examples of real people and some of their work and the fields they work in, the kinds of things that they're interested in. Effectively, if you're thinking of going into one of those industries, there's a good explanation here. It is a little bit of a marketing for it. I'm sure the engineer on the right doesn't go to work dressed like that all the time, but it's very nice exhibition for certainly for teenagers. In terms of, you've got the engineers, you've got technicians, explains the kind of things they do with wind farms and solar farms, how they build things, how they design things. And then as we work our way around, you have also scientists, so you have a good explanation of medical research, biotechnology, technicians in those. You can see how they work in a lab. There's some interactive elements to all of these stands, and very impressive. I liked it. I don't remember this from previous visits. I suspect this is fairly new. There was an innovation lab, I think, at this point at one time, and possibly this is what's replaced it. It's certainly a good addition. You're going around a museum which has predominantly children and teenagers visiting with their parents, and kids do love the Science Museum. Here is a section on technology in television, for example, and some of the things that they do on the more creative side of technology. And here there's quite a lot on medical. There's a little lab at the end, building a healthier world. Good digestible summary of these industries. Probably better than speaking to a careers officer at school. And here's a lab technician where you can try out various experiments. Probably the sort of exhibit that sparks an interest rather than confirming an interest, but puts a nice spin on science that makes it seem like something worth going in to do. Now here, this is the Wellcome galleries. If you watched my video about the Wellcome collection a few weeks ago, I went there and was quite surprised that their medical collection seemed to have disappeared. And I see where it is now. It's moved to the Science Museum, and this is a very substantial collection of medical science, but in the broadest sense. So you have things to do with autopsies, you have samples, you have autopsy tables, you have anatomy tables. You have here, this is an iron coffin. So the idea was that if body snatchers were going to dig up your grave and use you for medical research, you could lock your body inside this iron cage and your coffin sat within this, and it was basically to stop grave robbers. Because They really were stealing bodies and selling them to medical schools to do research. Here's some beautiful examples of anatomy and examining drawings, some equipment for undertaking those researchers, interesting medical models, explanations of how they measure the height and size of a child, here for mixing medicines. And again, I'm going around it quite swiftly. It's a substantial collection here. And if you're interested in medicine, definitely interesting to come and see. If you're really into this and this room interests you, then actually the Hunterian Museum in London is excellent, and you will definitely enjoy if you like this and you're not squeamish about body parts in glass cases. Unfortunately, they don't like people to video there, so obviously I respected that, and my video is mainly from me outside, but I did do a video of that and the John Soames Museum. Here's studies of phrenology and the shape of the head and the evolution of thought, the various trends and fashions that have happened in science. This is actually an autopsy table, so you put the body on there, that's the draining hole for the fluids, some of the clothes that they'd wear during an autopsy, segments of brains, bits of body, some anatomical models, beautiful old examples that give you an idea of how they evolved the knowledge of the musculature, bone structure, the organs. Very interesting pieces. I'll probably use interesting too much on this, but I think it's a good word for this museum. Very comprehensive, and if you're at all interested in science, there's something here for you. I think I actually enjoyed this floor with the flight and computers and medicine probably more than the ground floor, which I've seen a bit more often. And here's an early machine for imaging. Very old dated compared with those today. And a good explanation, they have various tools here, like there's a very early endoscope and different tools, even like that mirror with a hole in the middle there, so that you can get a clearer view of the patient. Here's a very early endoscope. I don't think I'd want that shoved inside me. I meant explanations of x-rays and science around that. Some early ultrasound scans. Some interesting, these hats, sort of coiled material to, I believe, help cool the head or get better clarity when you're inside an imaging machine. I'm not sure if they're still used today, but I did have a friend who went through cancer treatment, had to wear a cap, but he didn't enjoy it, and I didn't really question him enough to know whether it looks like that. Here are scanning electron microscopes. Some early equipment, well, early, so by the standards of this museum and this collection, not early, but very basic compared with today, along with some explanations of the understanding of the DNA and the construction of molecules, of different proteins, and how that actually helps them to get to the knowledge we have today of body. Here's inheritance of genetic makeup, and how if you have an error, you can inherit a disease. Explanation of the DNA. There's quite a graphical explanation of the building blocks of life and how the understanding of DNA and the chemical construction of molecules and various diseases and organs and proteins and everything involved with the human body's function, has helped to understand the causes and treatments of medicine. And then through to this, you'll be glad to hear it's one of the last galleries, but a fascinating collection of miscellaneous medical related items. There's all sorts of eyewear and false eyes and examples of, here's a mechanical wheelchair, electric wheelchair, various equipment used in medicine and treatments and health. It really is comprehensive, from Egyptian canopic jars there for storing the organs, and different types of stethoscope, different prosthetics that have been developed over centuries for people, study aids with models of the human body, and various treatments, even buckets for soiled dressings from hospitals. Very comprehensive and substantial collection of very different items, even through to here that's a cycle ambulance. And there are various tools and equipment. Here you have some beds from hospitals, and you see how they've changed over the years, from what looks like a punishment for criminals through to the modern day bed. And then inside surgery, there's a collection of machines, equipment, tools, models, clothes, early incubator there, and all these different microscopes and tools for undertaking operations, some which I must confess I don't know what they are. I think there's a machine for cleaning the blood. Someone could probably correct me on that. And in the First World War, the importance of the First World War in terms of the sheer number of people who needed to be treated and what they needed to be treated for. So there's a section on that, and Zimmer frame there. So some things it's very obvious what they are, some things are quite obscure. I certainly needed to read a few of the labels, but quite fascinating. And I was worried this collection had just gone out of public view, because it does cover the whole of sort of scientific medicine, if you like, from the beginnings of anatomy based medicine and the development of modern science and treatments, even though that's drying racks for blood, so the blood is prepared properly. See, I'm not medical enough to describe that properly. At the end here there's a chemist. It's a beautiful recreation of a chemist. Reminds me a bit of the Black Country Museum has a series of shops. It's a street of shops that kind of give you an idea of what a normal street was like 200 years ago. And here it's a recreation of a high street chemist, and obviously looks a lot different to the Boots you go into today, but gives you a feel for the way medicine was delivered at the pharmacist level. And then there's quite a lot about the developments of different medicines, examples of medicines, and you can see here we're above the hall, the making of the modern age. And quite keys in this piece, because this really is the making of the modern age from the medical sense. So you have all these different aids and prosthetics for people with injuries and disabilities, various treatment systems, and it's an impressive collection. It's also quite a different view on the gallery on the ground floor, which we covered in the last video, and I really enjoyed. quite difficult to think what my highlights of this museum are, because certainly no single room encompasses the reason you should go here. There's a whole bunch of different masks for treatment, and there's an explanation of a hospital as medicine became more modern and there were hospital wards and various types of treatment. This explains the kind of health care of people who are sick, and goes through. Down at the end there's a padded cell. There's one you can go in which is a sort of reconstruction where it's not padded, and then there's a real padded cell next to it. Loads of advertising and marketing, famous posters. So you see, it's medical, but it's not just medicine. It's a very broad collection. Here you have a mobile healthcare, the back of a van. There is an explanation of that, along with here explanations of things like the pump there. So as they brought in improvements to sewage and they cleaned up, they understood that cholera was being spread. Before it had been an idea, but it came from miasma, from the sort of smells and breaths in the air. And there's an example of a water pump. One of the most famous breakthroughs in London, you can still see the location today, it's just round the corner from Liberty's, is a water pump where they discovered that was the source of a cholera outbreak. And it was only by proving that was the source that they were able to prove that they weren't spreading disease through smells, and it was actually sewage that got inside of the water pipes. Here's an iron lung, so people with polio who couldn't breathe by themselves would go in there, their head would stick out, and by creating pressure, it uses pressure to force the chest cavity and therefore the lungs to inflate and deflate. So it forced breathing to enable people to breathe. Doesn't look very comfortable, I have to say, and imagine you'd have to spend many hours inside that machine. There's all sorts of medical history here, and just down at the end is that padded cell. Here about quarantine, there's an explanation of quarantines, and there's one of those secure beds that you see the CDC using in movies. Health related history there on the right, and a straitjacket. There was two types, an adult and a child's version. I'm not sure which was worse, but the child's one was apparently more humane. Here's the reconstructed padded cell. Kind of looks like a padded cell, but when you touch the walls it's very obviously veneered wood. It's a good explanation of leprosy. And this is actually a body of a leper, and you can see some of the pitting and deformation in certain bones in the body. Quite gruesome. And hopefully you've enjoyed that. We've got one more room, which is about, if you like, non-medical intervention. So in terms of various cultures, responses to sickness, treatments for sickness, and ways of processing sickness and death. I'm certainly glad to see that this collection's remained intact, because I had wondered where it had gone. I would definitely recommend the Science Museum. I hope you've enjoyed this tour. I know it's a lot longer than I hoped it would be, but I was quite overwhelmed by how large the museum was compared to probably the last 4 or 5 times I've been. I've just done the ground floor, and I definitely underestimated just how substantial this museum is and how enjoyable it is. I think everything in here, all the exhibits are very interesting, well curated, well displayed, and it's not just for teenagers. I'd say you see a lot of kids and teenagers downstairs, but it is a very interesting museum for anyone with any interest in science. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you'll subscribe and you haven't fallen asleep listening to this rather long 2-part video, and we'll see you again soon. Every Monday there's a new museum video, and luckily there's a large stock of free museums around Britain, so there's plenty more to see.